In the frozen reaches of the north, where winters stretched like a long night and the sea's fury tested even the strongest hull, survival was no gift. It was earned through cunning, through toil, through the bitter bargain struck between man and the land that birthed him. And here, in this land of frost and iron, the story of 9 forgotten Viking superfoods that saved their life begins not in the feasting halls, where laughter and mead drowned the howling wind, but in the quiet hearths where families guarded their secret stores with as much jealousy as their weapons. For in a world where famine walked as closely as frostbite, food was no simple sustenance. It was shield and sword, the difference between a grave under the snow and another year lived beneath the northern sun. The Vikings, whose names thundered across seas and into sagas, are remembered for their raids, their ships, their blades. Yet steel alone does not conquer hunger. The sagas were not written on empty stomachs. Behind every warband that braved the whale road, behind every farmer who endured the long dark, stood a pantry filled not with luxuries, but with treasures the land and sea offered in quiet abundance. These were not the soft indulgences of southern courts, but hard-won superfoods, grains that kept their bellies strong, fish that nourished their sinews, berries that healed, honey that preserved life when nothing else could. They were forgotten only because history chose to remember the blood-stained axe and not the barley bread, the long ship but not the sky bowl. Yet without these hidden pillars of survival, the Viking age would have crumbled before it ever set sail. The land itself forced this wisdom upon them. In summer, when the sun lingered long in the sky and fields rolled gold, there was a season for harvest, slaughter, and storing. But winter devoured. Rivers froze, soil hardened to stone, and storms cut off farms from one another. The North gave no mercy, and so the Norse learned to wrest nourishment from every corner of their world. They salted fish until it outlasted the months of ice. They fermented milk into thick skyr, so it would not spoil but strengthen. They wandered into shadowed forests and picked the sharp red lingonberry, bitter but packed with the power to ward off weakness and rot. What they gathered was not mere food, it was life pressed into jars, hides and casks, hidden away like weapons for the long campaign of winter. Think of a homestead on the coast of Norway as the first snow falls. The longhouse roof groans under the weight of ice, smoke curls through the smoke hole, and outside, the sea roars black against frozen stone. Inside, where children huddle near the fire and men mend sails by flickering torchlight, the true battle is fought against hunger. From a wooden chest lined with straw, a woman draws dried fish so hard it must be beaten before boiled. From a clay vessel she spoons out fermented milk, thick and sour but rich enough to fuel days of labour. These small miracles prepared months before in warmer air stand between her household and despair. Each mouthful is a victory won against the cruelest foe, time. Even the warriors who crossed the whale road in dragon-proud ships owed their strength not only to courage, but to these humble stores. Dried cod packed in bundles, nuts carried in leather pouches, barley bread hardened for the voyage all fed them when no fresh land was in sight. Without such food, their oars would have slowed, their eyes dulled, and their axes hung heavy in hand. A raiding crew that starved never returned. Those that landed with bellies firm and muscles taut brought terror to foreign shores. Their victories, sung in skaldic verse, owed as much to salted fish as to sharpened steel. But these superfoods were not only for strength of body, they healed. Honey was smeared upon wounds, sealing them from rot, while also poured into horn and cask, not just to sweeten but to preserve. Berries, sharp with their own medicine, chased away the sickness that lingered in dark winters. Even seaweed, gathered from shores where other food would not grow, provided minerals that staved off the slow wasting of the body. Every bite was knowledge distilled, passed down through generations who had tested the edge of starvation and learned what the land would give if pressed hard enough. They did not call them superfoods, for to them these were not novelties but lifelines. Yet when we speak now of the 9 forgotten Viking superfoods that saved their life, we speak of the invisible foundation of their world. The sagas tell us of kings, jarls and berserkers, but beneath it all there was bread baked from barley, bowls of skyr, fish hung to dry in sea winds, and berries gathered from marshes. These quiet staples endured where men and kingdoms often did not. They kept the bloodlines alive, allowed ships to cross oceans, and gave breath to the very songs that now echo across centuries. Without them, there would have been no Harold Fairhair uniting Norway, no Leif Erikson stepping onto new shores, no names for us to whisper in awe or fear. The Viking Age was not only carved in runes or raised in stone, it was built upon the humble strength of food that could endure the North itself. And so, as we open the hidden pantry of the Norse, we uncover not just what they ate, but how they lived, and how they survived. For in those long winters, when the winds howled and death stalked every corner, it was not the blade but the bowl, not the raid but the root, that decided who would see the dawn. And in that truth lies the heart of the story. To understand the Viking, we must look not only to his sword but to his table. We must step into that longhouse, smell the smoke, taste the sour tang of skyer, the salt bite of cod, the sweetness of honey on the tongue. We must see how life clung, stubborn and fierce, through the strength of these forgotten superfoods. Only then can we know how they endured the cold, conquered the seas, and etched their legend in the frost-bound earth of the north. The miracle of barley was not sung in the halls with the clash of shields and the boasting of warriors, yet it was present in every breath they drew, in every muscle that bent an oar or swung an axe. Barley was the quiet king of the north, a grain so stubborn it could grow in soils where other crops failed, so hardy it withstood the bitter breath of northern winds. Without it, the Viking Age would have been but a fleeting spark in the snow, for no man sails hungry, no woman weaves on an empty stomach, and no child survives winter without the steady nourishment pressed from the earth. When the long summer sun burned low on the horizon, barley fields rippled like bronze waves across Scandinavian valleys. Each stalk was not simply food, but the promise of survival. Families bent low at harvest, scythes slicing through the stalks, gathering in silence what the gods had allowed to grow. The sheaves were bound, dried, and stored with care, for every grain was a treasure greater than silver. In the dark months to come, when the sea froze in fury and snow buried the land, it would be barley that simmered in iron cauldrons, barley that filled wooden bowls, and barley that gave warmth to bodies chilled to the marrow. Porridge was its first gift, thick, steaming, and heavy with sustenance. Children and elders alike ate it before stepping out into the cold, and warriors carried its strength into the fields. Sometimes sweetened with a touch of honey, sometimes salted with dried fish or herbs, it was never wasted. Each spoonful clung to the belly, warding off hunger like a shield against the spear. For those who toiled in the fields or rode the whale road, porridge was not a meal but a lifeline, the fuel that turned weakness into endurance. But barley's strength did not stop at porridge. Ground fine, it became flour for bread baked on flat stones or in clay ovens. These loaves, dense and dark, travelled well and endured long journeys, keeping raiders and traders alive far from home. Hard barley bread could be stored for months, softening only when dipped into broth or ale. Farmers ate it in the fields, sailors at sea, warriors in camps before battle. Wherever the Norse went, whether across Green Island, icy Greenland, or distant Vinland, barley bread followed, as faithful as any companion. And then there was ale, the drink of gods and men alike. Barley transformed in the cauldron and barrel, steeped in water, flavoured with herbs, fermented with wild yeasts. It was more than drink, it was medicine, ritual, and joy. In the hall, horns clashed and voices rose, but beneath the laughter was barley's gift, warming blood and binding men in fellowship. To drink ale was to honour the gods, to mark peace between neighbours, to celebrate victories. Even in solemn moments, when wounds needed cleansing or illness struck, barley ale was turned to for healing, its strength trusted to cleanse and restore. In every form, bread, porridge, or drink barley fed not only the body but the spirit of a people. The sagas rarely pause to speak of grain, but its presence lies beneath every tale. When a crew of raiders endured weeks at sea, it was the dried bread of barley that filled their packs. When a homestead survived a winter of storms, it was the porridge bubbling in the pot that kept death at bay. When mead ran short or honey was scarce, ale brewed from barley kept the cups full and the feasts alive. Without it, no feast could honour a jarl, no journey could last, and no household could endure the cold grasp of January. Barley even found its place in healing. Crushed and mixed with herbs, it soothed wounds and fevers. A poultice laid gently on torn flesh. Broths made from it nourished the weak, easing the suffering of the sick and the old. Women, keepers of the hearth and the healing arts, guarded these recipes with reverence, passing them down as carefully as any heirloom. In the Viking mind, barley was not simply food, it was a gift of the earth, given by the gods, a bridge between hunger and survival. Picture the longhouse in the depth of winter. Outside, Snow falls thick and heavy, muffling the world in silence. Inside, the hearth crackles, shadows dancing on timbered walls. A cauldron hangs above the fire, filled with porridge thick as paste. Children wait with wide eyes, their bellies hollow, until the wooden ladle dips and pours steaming barley into bowls. A man, weary from chopping wood, breaks a piece of bread to share with his kin. Later, horns of ale are raised, and though the winds rage outside, warmth spreads through the hall. All of it, every breath of strength, every spark of comfort, owes itself to the grain that grew stubbornly in the cold fields of the north. The miracle of barley is that it was ordinary. So common it was often taken for granted. Yet without it, the north could not have sustained its people, its farms, its fleets. It was never sung of in verse, for it lacked the glamour of gold or the drama of battle. But in truth, barley was the unseen champion of the Viking world, the foundation upon which their strength was built. In every bowl, in every loaf, in every horn, it carried the weight of survival. And so, though we speak often of axes and ships, of kings and warriors, we must remember that their bones were built of barley, their victories were carried on its grain, their sagas told with its strength in their bellies. For it was barley, the grain of endurance, the grain of fellowship, the grain of life that kept the north alive when the world itself seemed intent on freezing them to silence. If barley was the king of the north, then oats and rye were its steadfast brothers, less sung of, yet no less vital. In their husks lay the hidden strength that fueled journeys across the Whale Road, that gave warriors the endurance to wield axe and shield from dawn until dusk, that carried farmers through the endless labour of the seasons. Where the soil was too poor for wheat, where the winds bit too sharp for tender crops, oats and rye rooted themselves, stubborn as the people who sowed them. Without their quiet power, the Viking age might have been little more than a whisper, for hunger would have slain more men than any sword. Rye was the grain of the rugged farmer, its stalks rising dark and tall against grey northern skies. It thrived in poor earth, where frost licked the soil and storms battered the fields. The bread it birthed was dense, heavy, and dark, its flavour sharp and sour from the leaven that fermented it. This was no soft loaf to crumble in the hand, but a hard companion, meant to last, meant to fill. A single slice could anchor the belly through long hours of toil. Sailors carried it wrapped in cloth, gnawed at it between strokes of the oar, softened it with broth or ale when teeth ached from its toughness. Yet in that toughness lay endurance, for rye did not spoil quickly. Its bread could be carried far across seas and months of winter, feeding men long after fresh stores had vanished. Oats, humbler still, were the grain of the poor and the wise alike. They grew where even rye faltered, hardy against the cold and damp. Ground into meal, oats became porridge steaming thick and hearty. Children ate it at dawn before stepping out into frost, warriors before battle, and the old to sustain them through their waning strength. Sometimes stirred with milk, sometimes with berries when summer allowed. Oats were the warm breath of the hearth, a dish that clung to the ribs and lent quiet might. Oatcakes, flat and plain, travelled well, and were carried by hunters into the woods and by scouts along lonely paths. In their simplicity was power, for oats gave not the sudden fire of sweetness, but the slow, steady burn of endurance. Together, oats and rye built the stamina of a people. A Viking did not rise each morning with empty stomach and weak limbs. He broke his fast with grains that gave him hours of strength, that carried him through the heft of timber, the forging of iron, the rowing of ships across cruel seas. When a raiding crew set sail for distant lands, they carried more than blades and courage. They carried sacks of grain, ground fine, and baked into loaves or stored as meal to be boiled at sea. Without those stores, their voyage would falter before the horizon was crossed. With them, their endurance became a weapon sharper than steel. The preparation of these grains was no less important than the grains themselves. Rye was fermented into sourdough, its wild yeasts giving rise to loaves that lasted far beyond ordinary bread. This fermentation lent flavour but also strength, making the bread easier to keep and digest. Oats were dried and ground, stored in sacks that could endure damp voyages. With a pot, water, and fire, they transformed into porridge wherever the Norse went, a meal as constant as the tide. In these methods lay Viking craft, simple, practical, but clever enough to squeeze the most from what the land allowed. In the sagas, there are few words spent on such food, for skalds chose to sing of blood and glory, not porridge and bread. Yet without these humble meals, no saga could have been told. Imagine the longship at sea, waves rising like mountains, oars beating against the deep. The men pull with rhythm, their arms like iron, but their strength comes not only from will. It comes from the oat porridge they ate before setting sail, from the rye bread packed into their sacks. Without it, the rhythm would falter, the oars grow heavy, and the ship would drift into death's arms. With it, they rode farther than any people before them, striking fear into kingdoms unprepared for the Northmen's endurance. Even in times of peace, oats and rye bound the people to survival. In longhouses buried beneath winter snows when hunting failed and fish were scarce, the cauldron of porridge simmered, and the rye loaf was cut thin to stretch across many mouths. These grains fed children through the hunger months, allowed mothers to nurse, and gave elders a reason to rise another day. They were not feasting foods, nor were they offered to impress guests, but they were the foundation upon which life stood when all else threatened to collapse. Their strength was not only of the body but of the spirit. To eat rye bread was to taste resilience itself, to chew the bitter, sour edge and know that one had endured. To swallow oat porridge was to feel the warmth of kinship, for it was a meal shared, ladled out in bowls around the fire, uniting the household in quiet strength. These were the foods of memory, of survival passed down through generations. They taught patience, endurance, and the truth that greatness is not only in the sword swing, but in the grains that allow the hand to hold the sword at all. Thus the strength of oats and rye was not loud, but it was lasting. They built the bodies that felled kings, the stamina that rode across oceans, the endurance that raised farms in frozen lands. Where barley gave breadth, oats and rye gave depth, a power that did not flare and fade but smouldered long, steady and unyielding. They were the quiet pulse beneath Viking life, the humble grains that carried a people through hunger, across seas and into legend. The sea was a cruel mistress, yet within her depths lay the very lifeblood of the North. To the Vikings, fish were not mere food but salvation itself, pulled from dark waters that could claim a man's life as swiftly as they sustained it. Herring, salmon, and cod, these were the silent allies of the Norse, the flesh of the cold seas that gave muscle to their arms and endurance to their voyages. Without fish, no longship would have crossed the whale road, no farmstead endured the hunger months, and no saga reached beyond a single generation. Picture the coast at dawn, mist curling over black waters, longboats drawn up on the shingle, and men standing with nets and lines in hand. The sea groaned with life, though it yielded nothing without struggle. Cod were dragged up heavy and thrashing, their bodies thick with white flesh, while herring swarmed in glittering shoals, caught in woven nets that strained under their weight. Salmon leapt in rivers and streams, their silver bodies flashing like blades in the sun, chased by men who knew their patterns as well as they knew the path of stars. Every catch was a gamble against storm and wave, but every haul was a victory that meant the difference between feast and famine. Fish were more than fresh meals, they were life-preserved, the guarantee of survival when ice choked the land and snow buried the fields. The Vikings mastered the art of salting and drying, turning the sea's bounty into stores that endured the longest winters and the farthest voyages. Cod, split open and hung on racks to dry in the salt wind, became stockfish, so hard it could outlast months, even years. It was beaten with mallets to soften, boiled in cauldrons and eaten with bread. Herring, packed in salt, travelled across seas in barrels, feeding crews for entire journeys. Salmon, rich and oily, was smoked over slow fires, its flavour sinking deep into the flesh until it became a delicacy that lasted through the dark. These were not luxuries, they were the backbone of survival, food that kept death at bay when the land gave nothing. On the whale road, fish became as vital as the timber of the ship itself. A longship setting out for distant shores carried dried cod in bundles, herring salted into barrels, and sometimes even fermented fish, strong-smelling but enduring. The men would break their fast with it, gnawing on hard stockfish softened with water or ale, the protein and fat seeping into their blood, giving them the stamina to row for hours against the sea. Without it, no crew could endure the endless rhythm of oar and wave. With it, their strength became unyielding, their journeys stretching farther than any people before them. Even in the heart of the homeland, fish held power. The longhouses of coastal farms filled their lofts with drying racks, the smell of salt and sea mingling with smoke from the hearth. Inland, where seas could not be reached, trade brought barrels of fish up rivers and across valleys, exchanged for furs, iron, or grain. To own fish stores was to own life, and families measured their wealth not only in cattle or silver, but in how many racks of stockfish hung in their smokehouses, how many barrels of herring lined their cellars. It was a currency of survival, more valuable in the dead of winter than gold. Fish also bound men to the gods. Sacrifices of the sea's bounty were offered at feasts to honour Njord, the god of seafaring and harvest, and at times of famine when the waves seemed barren. Rivers where salmon ran were seen as sacred, their abundance a gift from divine hands. Fishermen whispered oaths over their nets, praying for safety and bounty, for they knew well that the sea gave with one hand and took with the other. A storm could drown a man before his catch was hauled aboard, yet without daring the waters, hunger would claim him all the same. The strength of fish was not only in their flesh, but in their richness. The fat of salmon and herring warmed the body through frozen nights, keeping the chill of the north at bay. Cod, lean yet plentiful, filled bellies and could be caught in staggering numbers, a single haul feeding dozens. Children grew tall on fish broth, and elders found renewed strength in its nourishment. The warriors who stormed the monasteries of Lindisfarne or rode into Frankish rivers did so with the power of fish coursing through their limbs. Their endurance built not on feasting meats alone, but on the steady, unyielding sustenance of the cold seas. The sagas speak often of raids, of kingdoms burned and treasures won, but the truer treasure was pulled from the waters each dawn. The hoards of silver and gold glittered for a time, but without fish, no raider would have survived the voyage home to boast of his prize. Without dried cod and salted herring, no settlement would have endured the endless hunger months. Without smoked salmon, rich with oil, no feast could have brought warmth to the dark midwinter nights. Fish were the unspoken treasure, the foundation upon which all Viking glory was built. In every bite of stockfish gnawed on a creaking longship, in every spoonful of fish broth served by the hearth, lay the true strength of the Norse. The cold seas gave them their power, and the Vikings, fierce and cunning, learned to take it, preserve it, and turn it into the lifeline that carried them across oceans and into legend. In the silence of the drying racks, in the barrels stored deep in the earth, the future of the North was kept safe. The axe may have carved their place in history, but it was the fish of the cold seas that made sure they lived long enough to wield it. In the smoky dimness of a Viking longhouse, where the air carried the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and damp wool, there was another smell, sharp and tangy, rising from clay vessels set carefully near the hearth. It was the scent of skyer, a food born of patience, craft, and necessity. Thick as curd, sour on the tongue, and rich with strength, it was far more than a simple meal. Skyer was survival pressed into a bowl, the secret weapon of the Norse that built bodies sturdy enough to endure winters when the world seemed to wither under frost. It was the Viking yogurt, though no such word passed their lips, and its power was such that it outlasted the age of longships and still lives in Iceland today. Dairy was the gift of cattle, sheep, and goats, animals as sacred to the household as weapons were to the warrior. Milk flowed in summer when pastures were green, but it spoiled quickly, too fragile to store for the long hunger months. The Norse, ever resourceful, learned to trap its strength through fermentation. By curdling milk, straining it through cloth, and letting time and wild cultures work their alchemy, they crafted skyer dense, tangy, and nourishing. What began as a necessity became a treasure, a food that lasted long after fresh milk had soured. Stored in sealed vessels, skyer could endure weeks, even months, its sourness protecting it from rot while preserving the strength within. For the Viking farmer, skyr was the anchor of the household table. Children ate it with honey or berries when such luxuries were at hand, while labourers swallowed it plain before setting to work in the fields. Warriors spooned it down before long journeys, knowing it would hold their hunger in check for hours. Its protein filled their muscles, its richness lent them endurance, and its sour bite reminded them of the strength needed to survive the north. Unlike bread, which could be eaten in haste, skyer required time to craft, time to ferment, time to strain. Each bowl was a testament to patience, to the quiet labour that underpinned every bold act of conquest. Even in the sagas, where blood and glory dominate, the presence of skyer lingers in the background. Banquets where meat and mead dazzled the eye also relied on the humble vessels of fermented dairy to sustain the feasting. In the silence of winter nights, when snow pressed against the walls and darkness smothered the land, families gathered around the fire with bowls of skyer to share, its sour tang cutting the monotony of dried fish and stored grains. It was a food of endurance, and in endurance the Norse found their triumph. The making of skyer was no casual art. Women, the keepers of the hearth, guarded the knowledge closely. Milk was set to curdle, and the thickened mass strained through woven cloth until much of its whey had drained. What remained was not liquid but a solid cream, thick enough to be cut with a spoon, rich enough to feed a man through labour in field or battle. Some of the whey was stored aside, mixed with water into a sour drink that slaked thirst and replenished what sweat stole away. Nothing was wasted, for in a world where survival was a daily test, every drop of nourishment counted. The power of Skya lay not only in its sustenance but in its ability to heal. Its sourness calmed uneasy stomachs, its richness restored strength to the weary, and its hidden cultures warded off sickness. Without knowledge of why, the Norse knew that Skya kept bellies firm and bodies strong, less prone to the fevers that struck when food spoiled or guts weakened. For mothers, it gave the strength to nurse. For elders, it was soft and filling when teeth could no longer chew hard bread or dried meat. For warriors, it was the meal that could be carried in vessels aboard a ship, eaten quickly when time was scarce, and relied upon when other stores ran dry. In the trade routes that stretched from Iceland to the Baltic, Skya became more than household fare. It was wealth. Iceland, harsh and isolated, leaned upon Skya as one of its treasures, trading it in thick slabs or packed vessels, carried across seas to nourish others. It became a mark of endurance for that land, as important as fish or wool. To this day, Iceland guards Skya like a relic, a survival food that became identity, linking the present to the days when Vikings stood on icy shores and stared out across the grey seas in search of new worlds. Imagine a raider on the morning of his voyage. He straps on his sword, checks the edge of his axe, and pulls on his mail, but before he boards the ship, he eats a bowl of Skya. It steadies his hunger, fills his belly with quiet strength, and keeps his body ready for the sea's trial. Hours later, as the longship heaves against endless waves, when the salt spray stings his face and muscles burn from the oar, the strength of that meal still holds, as if the sour taste of Skya lingers in his blood. This was its gift, not glory, not luxury, but the steady endurance that made glory possible. The sagas may not boast of Skya, for warriors preferred to be remembered for steel and blood. Yet beneath every raid, every journey, every winter survived, there was a bowl of this sour, unassuming food. The Norse, who carved kingdoms out of ice and sea, owed much to Skya. It was not the feast food of kings, but the survival food of a people who would not be broken by hunger. In its tang lay the flavour of endurance, in its thickness the weight of survival, in its persistence the spirit of the North. And so, Skya was more than food. It was a bridge between life and death, between hunger and strength, between despair and survival. It was the whisper of the cow in summer meadows carried through the months of snow, the memory of green fields when the world lay white and barren. Long after axes dulled and ships rotted, Skya endured, as it endures still, sour and strong, a living memory of the Viking age. In the deep silence of the northern forests, where pine needles carpet the earth and the air carries the bite of frost even in summer's shadow, there grew treasures more powerful than gold. The Vikings knew these treasures well, though they never glittered in the sun nor chimed like silver. They were berries small, bright, and easily overlooked, yet filled with the strength that kept men alive when the cold threatened to break them. Lingonberries, cloudberries, and bilberries were not merely wild fruit plucked for sweetness. They were medicine, endurance, and shield against sickness. Gathered by careful hands and stored as if they were charms against death. To the Norse, berries were the breath of the forest, fleeting gifts of summer that promised survival in the months of hunger. The women and children scoured the woods when the days grew long, filling baskets with the red, gold, and deep blue of the land's bounty. Each berry was gathered not only for pleasure, but for the knowledge that come winter, when snow swallowed the earth and fresh food vanished, these fruits would stand as silent guardians against weakness and disease. They were crushed, dried, or boiled into preserves, kept in wooden tubs or sealed in animal skins, so that their power would not fade when the sun itself seemed lost. The lingonberry, sharp and red as blood, was the most common and most trusted. Its taste was tart, biting the tongue, but its strength was unmatched. Families mixed it with porridge, meat, or fish, its sourness cutting through the heaviness of winter fare. It was more than flavour, it was protection. In times when meat alone would sicken the body and darkness drain the spirit, lingonberries gave vigour, warding off illness that crept in with the cold. Mothers fed them to children through the frost months, knowing instinctively what modern healers would only later confirm: that within their scarlet flesh lay the power to keep fever and rot at bay. Cloudberries were rarer, growing in the bogs and marshes, glowing gold like drops of the sun fallen into the moss. Sweet, rich, and prized above all others, they were gathered carefully and guarded jealously, for they did not grow in every land. To eat them was to taste the fleeting warmth of summer in the heart of winter. They restored strength to the weary, revived the sick, and were often reserved for the most vulnerable, the old, the weak, and women recovering from childbirth. Their golden colour seemed almost sacred, a reminder that the gods still favoured those who endured. In sagas untold by skalds, in quiet households where survival was the only victory, cloudberries played their part, their hidden potency carrying the weak across the threshold of death back into life. The bilberry, dark as midnight, filled the woods with its secret harvest. Small, plentiful, and staining lips with its blue dye, it was a fruit of endurance. Hunters carried handfuls into the mountains, their slow sweetness staving off hunger during long pursuits. Warriors chewed them before battle, their bodies charged with the quiet energy that the bilberries gave. They were boiled into syrups, mixed into breads, or eaten fresh by the fistful, leaving behind the mark of their colour as proof of their nourishment. These berries did not boast with sweetness, but their strength was in their constancy, always there, filling the undergrowth in summer, ready to be taken by those who knew where to look. Yet berries were not only food, they were medicine. Crushed into poultices, lingonberries cleaned wounds and slowed infection. Cloudberries, rich and potent, soothed fevers and revived the ailing. Bilberries sharpened the eyes, hunters believed, allowing them to see through twilight when stalking prey. Women skilled in herbs carried this knowledge as part of their craft, mixing berries with honey or herbs into remedies whispered over the sick. A spoonful of berry syrup could ease the burning throat, strengthen a faltering heart, or restore appetite to one wasting away. In a world without physicians, the forest's small fruits became healers in their own right. The endurance of the Vikings cannot be told without speaking of these berries. When ships sailed far from home, crews carried dried or preserved stores to guard against the weakness of long voyages. When families huddled through the endless dark of winter, the bright jars of berries preserved from summer gave them not only sustenance but hope, a reminder that the sun would return and life would bloom again. In the rhythm of seasons, berries became symbols of survival, summer's fleeting abundance transformed into winter's quiet salvation. The sagas do not linger on the gathering of berries, for the poets chose instead to sing of blood spilled and treasures won. Yet beneath the silence of verse lies the truth that no axe could have been lifted. No longship rode, no farm survived, without the nourishment of the land's smallest gifts. A warrior's strength may have been measured in battle, but it was first built in the kitchen of his mother, where porridge was stirred with lingonberries and bilberries sweetened the bread. Imagine a hearth in the heart of winter. Outside, winds scream across the land, snow heaps against the walls, and hunger prowls in the darkness. Inside, a woman opens a sealed vessel and draws out cloudberries preserved in honey, their golden flesh gleaming like captured sunlight. She spoons them into the mouth of her ailing father, his fever breaking slowly as warmth returns to his skin. At the same table, children dip hard bread into lingonberry syrup, their lips stained red, their bodies kept strong against the frost. This was the true miracle of the berries, not their taste alone, but their power to heal, to preserve, to give life when all else withered. The healing power of berries was not an accident, but a wisdom born of generations who had walked the line between survival and starvation. They knew the forest not as a place of shadows, but as a pantry of remedies, where small fruits held the strength to carry life through winter's cruelty. Lingonberries, cloudberries, and bilberries, these were the forest jewels, small enough to fit in a hand, powerful enough to sustain a people whose lives were carved against the grain of the world. In their bright colours lay the secret to Viking endurance. Red for the blood that would not falter, gold for the light that would not fade, blue for the night that could be conquered. With them, the Norse endured storms, crossed seas, and weathered winters that should have broken them. They were the quiet healers of the north, and without them, the sagas of the Vikings might have ended not in conquest and glory, but in silence beneath the snow. In a world of salt winds and biting frost, sweetness was a rare and treasured thing. Yet the Vikings knew of one golden gift that shone brighter than silver and carried more worth than gold. Honey. To them it was more than food, it was medicine, preservative, and the very soul of mead, the drink that bound warriors in fellowship and touched the realm of the gods. Honey was the golden lifesaver of the north, a substance so valued that hives were guarded as fiercely as livestock, for within their waxen chambers lay not just sweetness, but survival. Bees were not common across the harshest lands of Scandinavia. And so honey was scarce, a treasure gathered where meadows bloomed or traded from distant places. Those who kept bees tended them with care, for their labour yielded something no other food could match. Honey did not spoil. While meat rotted, bread hardened, and even dried fish eventually failed, honey endured. Sealed in jars of clay or horn, it could be carried on voyages and stored through winters, a golden wealth that never withered. A spoonful sweetened porridge, softened the bitterness of herbs, and gave strength to children whose bodies wavered in the frost. To hold honey in one's hand was to hold a fragment of summer, caught and preserved by the toil of bees and the wisdom of men. Its power lay not only in taste but in preservation. The Vikings discovered that meat packed in honey, or fish glazed with it, lasted longer and resisted decay. Fruits and berries sealed within honey retained their strength, their flavour held through the dark months as if trapped in amber. In this way, honey became a weapon against hunger, a storehouse of sweetness that turned perishable foods into treasures lasting well beyond their season. Where salt and smoke worked in the service of survival, honey stood as their golden equal, a preservative that guarded life itself. Yet honey's worth reached further still, into the realm of healing. When battle tore flesh and blade cut deep, it was honey that women and healers smeared into wounds. Its golden touch closed gashes, warded off rot, and soothed pain. Burns, sores, and infections yielded to it, for honey cleansed where other remedies faltered. It was poured into drinks to ease sore throats, mixed with herbs to drive away fever, and fed to the weak to return them to strength. Without knowledge of its hidden properties, the Norse understood its truth. Honey healed. It was a gift not only of the body, but of the gods themselves, a lifeline for warriors, farmers, and children alike. But nowhere did honey shine brighter than in the making of mead, the drink of celebration and of myth. Mixed with water and left to ferment, it transformed into the golden liquor that filled horns in the halls of jarls and kings. Mead was not only drink, it was poetry liquid, the very lifeblood of feasting. When warriors returned from raids, it was mead that flowed, binding them in brotherhood. When alliances were forged and oaths sworn, it was mead that sealed the promises, its sweetness washing over lips as words were spoken before gods and men. To drink mead was to taste joy, to claim a moment of victory over the cold and hunger that ruled the north. The skalds told of mead as divine, the mead of poetry stolen from the giants and gifted by Odin himself. To them, it was not only drink but inspiration, the fire that stirred verse and song, the courage that loosed tongues in the feast. Horns raised high spilled its golden gleam in torchlight, and in those moments the world seemed to belong to the Vikings alone, their laughter and boasts echoing through the rafters like thunder. Mead made men forget sorrow, made friends of enemies, and drew every heart in the hall into a single pulse of triumph. Without honey there would be no mead, and without mead the feasts of the Norse would have been hollow shadows. Imagine a hall in the dead of winter. Outside, snow heaps against the door, the wind shrieks across the roof, and the world lies frozen. Inside, the hearth roars, warriors gather shoulder to shoulder, and horns brimming with mead pass from hand to hand. The sweetness coats their tongues, warms their bellies, and sends fire into their veins. Songs rise, stories are told, and even in the heart of the frost, life glows golden. That glow comes not from fire alone, but from honey, the golden gift carried from summer fields into the heart of winter's despair. Even beyond feasting, honey held a place in ritual. Offerings were made with it to the gods, poured out as libations or mixed into sacred brews. It was laid upon the graves of the dead, a gift for the journey beyond, for what better gift could one carry into the other world than the sweetness of life itself? In honey, men saw a taste of the divine, a substance both earthly and eternal, fragile yet everlasting. It was a bridge between man and God, mortal struggle and immortal reward. Though the Vikings left behind their halls, their ships, and their kingdoms, honey endures as a reminder of their cunning and reverence. It was sweetness in a world of bitterness, healing in a time of wounds, preservation in an age of rot. It carried them through hunger, through darkness, through battle and feast alike. In its golden shimmer lay the promise of life, a promise kept by the bees of summer, and guarded by the hands of those who knew its worth. Honey was more than a food. It was memory, medicine, and myth. The golden lifesaver of the North. It healed their wounds, preserved their stores, sweetened their hunger, and filled their horns with the drink of gods. Without it, the Vikings might still have fought and sailed, but their world would have been colder, harsher, and emptier. With it, they tasted the divine even in the midst of frost, carrying the sun's warmth within them long after the fields lay buried in snow. Honey was their sweetness, their healer, their bond to gods and kin alike. It was, and remains, the golden heart of survival. In the shadowed groves of the north, where pine and birch rose against grey skies, the forest gave gifts not of flesh or fruit alone, but of hard-shelled power hidden in husks and pods. To the Vikings, these were treasures often overlooked by song, but never by hunger nuts and seeds. Small but mighty, packed with strength that endured long after fields froze and the sea turned to iron. Hazelnuts, flax and hemp seeds were the secret storehouses of life, gathered in sacks and jars, traded across lands, and guarded like coin. They were dense with nourishment, easy to keep, and when the lean months came, they were as valuable as any hoard of silver. The hazel tree, standing quiet in the glades, was one of the forest's greatest allies. Its nuts, round and hard-shelled, ripened in autumn and were gathered eagerly, for their worth was known to every household. Once cracked, the meat within carried oils and strength that warmed the body through winter's cruelty. Hazelnuts were eaten raw by hunters on long treks, roasted over fire to bring out their sweetness, or ground into meal to enrich bread and porridge. They were light to carry and slow to spoil, making them perfect companions for journeys by land and sea. A pouch of hazelnuts tucked at a warrior's belt could mean the difference between endurance and collapse when provisions thinned. And beyond food, the hazel carried a place in myth, whispered of as a tree of wisdom and divination, its nuts symbols of hidden knowledge as well as hidden strength. Flax, though humbler in appearance, was a crop of immense value. From its fibres came linen for clothing and sails, but from its seeds came nourishment as precious as any grain. The seeds were small, dark, and rich with oils that lent vigour to the body. Crushed into meal, they were stirred into porridge, thickening it and deepening its power. Pressed for oil, they provided fuel and food alike, a richness that sustained both hearth and flesh. Flax seeds, though often overshadowed by the strength of barley or oats, were a quiet force in the Viking diet, building stamina for toil in fields and voyages on the whale road. To the Norse, nothing of flax was wasted. Stalk for cloth, fibre for rope, and seed for food. It was a plant of completeness, binding survival together in every part of its being. Hemp, too, grew as a servant of both hand and hunger. Its stalks became rope and sailcloth, its fibres woven into garments, but its seeds were gathered for food. Small, round, and rich in oils, hemp seeds carried energy enough to fortify those who worked long hours beneath a cold sky. They were boiled into gruels, mixed into bread, or eaten raw, their earthy taste a reminder that even the smallest things of the land carried power. For those who journeyed far, hemp seeds packed into pouches were light to carry, yet heavy with sustenance, a storehouse of endurance that could be shared among many. While the sagas do not sing of hemp as they do of steel and storm, its seeds played their part in feeding the hands that built the ships and carried the axes. These nuts and seeds were not feasting foods, but survival foods, the quiet treasures of the land. They were gathered in autumn with careful hands, dried and stored in earthen jars, hidden in lofts above the hearth where smoke and heat kept them safe from mould and pests. Families guarded these stores as closely as they guarded their weapons, for when snow fell heavy and fields yielded nothing, it was to these jars they turned. A handful of hazelnuts, a spoonful of flax or hemp seeds, could stretch a meagre meal into something that sustained an entire household. Trade routes carried them far beyond their forest homes. Hazelnuts especially were valued as commodities, carried in sacks along rivers and across seas, exchanged for iron, furs, and even silver. Archaeologists digging in old settlements have found charred remains of hazelnuts where longhouses once stood, proof that these small treasures were roasted and eaten by the same hands that built ships and forged blades. In times of plenty they were traded, in times of scarcity they were hoarded like coin. The power of nuts and seeds was not only in nourishment but in endurance. Their oils filled bellies with warmth, their proteins strengthened muscles for labour and war. They were food for the lean months, when salted fish and dried bread alone would sap the body of vigour. A family that had jars of nuts and seeds in storage faced the winter with hope, A family without them faced hunger, gnawing like wolves at the door. They gave variety to meals, richness to porridge, and the promise of health when fresh food could not be had. Imagine the hearth in late winter, when supplies have dwindled. The cauldron holds a thin porridge of oats, barely enough to fill. Into it, a woman stirs crushed flax seeds, adding substance where there was little. A man, weary from tending cattle in the frozen fields, eats them slowly, savouring the strength they give. It is not a feast, but it is life, and life in such times was victory enough. Even warriors knew their worth. On voyages, sacks of dried fish might feed the crew, but it was the nuts and seeds carried in smaller pouches that gave variety and kept weakness at bay. Cracked open on the rocking deck of a longship, a hazelnut was more than food. It was a reminder of the forests of home, of the hearth waiting beyond the storm. Seeds stirred into gruel aboard ship provided not just sustenance but endurance, a hidden reserve of power that let the Norse push farther than others dared. Though the skalds rarely named them in verse, the quiet truth remained. The great deeds of kings and raiders were built upon small things. Hazelnuts cracked by the fire, flax seeds stirred into porridge, hemp seeds carried in pouches, these were the foundation upon which ships sailed and kingdoms rose. Without them the body would weaken, the spirit falter, and the north fall silent beneath snow. The nuts and seeds of the forest were not glorious, but they were enduring. They were the food that outlasted storm and famine, the treasures that could be traded or hoarded, the gifts of the land that turned hunger into strength. In their hardness lay survival, in their oils lay warmth, and in their abundance lay the quiet assurance that even in the leanest times, life would endure. For the Vikings, these humble stores were as precious as silver, the silent treasures of the forest that kept them strong enough to carve their legend into the world. Along the jagged coasts of the north, where waves thundered against black stone and gulls wheeled over the foam, there lay a bounty most often ignored by the songs of skalds but never by the hunger of the people. Seaweed and kelp, the greens of the ocean, clung to the rocks in thick mats, torn free by storms and cast upon the shore. To strangers they may have seemed little more than debris, slippery tangles fit only for the tide. But to the Vikings, ever watchful for what might stave off famine, these weeds of the sea were quiet saviours, rich in strength when fields failed and the soil gave nothing. The ocean gave not only fish, seals and whales, but also these humble plants, steeped in minerals that the body craved. When sickness spread in winters of poor harvest, when livestock withered and grain stores ran thin, it was seaweed that offered what the earth withheld. Gathered from rocky inlets or collected after storms, it was dried, stored, and eaten in many forms. Some was chewed raw, its salty tang bracing against the tongue. Some was boiled into broths, lending its essence to soups of fish or grain. Dried kelp was ground into powders to mix with porridge, its hidden power strengthening bone, blood, and spirit alike. In its dark, leathery fronds, the Vikings drew the minerals that sustained their bodies through famine, iodine to keep them from wasting sickness, salts to restore what sweat and labour took away. For the coastal farmer or fisherman, seaweed was a gift as steady as the tide. It was not merely food, but also fodder for animals when grass grew scarce, and even fertiliser to feed the soil when fields lay weary. Sheep and cattle ate of it, their milk richened by its trace, their flesh fortified by the sea's strength. In this way, seaweed fed not only the Viking himself but his beasts, and through them his entire household. The land and sea met in those rocky shores, and the Vikings, cunning and practical, wasted none of it. In the sagas, the great feasts are sung of mead, roasted meats, fresh fish, and bread. Yet beneath the feast lay the daily truth of survival, and here seaweed played its part. Few poets wasted words on it, for it lacked the glamour of honeyed mead or golden grain. Yet without it, households along the coast might have fallen to famine, their children weakened by want of nourishment. A bowl of thin fish broth thickened with kelp was no feast, but it carried strength enough to last another day, and in the cruel arithmetic of survival, another day often meant the difference between life and death. Seaweed also carried its place in healing. Its broths were given to the sick, restoring what had been lost in fever and sweat. Healers used it in poultices, applying its damp strength to soothe burns and wounds. Its salts drew out infection, its minerals restored balance. Though no Vikings spoke in the language of scholars, they knew the truth of it, that the sea's greens gave healing as surely as they gave sustenance. When the gods seemed cruel and crops withered under frost or storm, seaweed stood as proof that the ocean's hand was not always harsh, that even in its wildness it gave life. Trade carried seaweed too, though less as food and more as resource. Dried kelp was burned for ash, its salts and minerals sought by craftsmen for tanning, dyeing, and even preserving. In this way, it served not only the body but the crafts of daily life, its usefulness woven quietly into the fabric of Norse survival. What could not be eaten was used, and what could not be used was burned for its worth. Nothing of it was wasted, for in the Viking mind, to waste was to mock the gods who gave. Imagine a household in the heart of a lean winter. The grain chest is near empty, the dried fish nearly gone, and the cold howls outside the longhouse like a beast at the door. A woman stirs a pot over the hearth, into which she drops dried kelp gathered months before and stored in bundles. The broth grows thick and dark, its scent sharp with salt and sea. Into it she adds what little remains, perhaps a scrap of fish, a handful of oats. The children eat, their hunger eased, their bodies strengthened by minerals unseen but deeply felt. It is not plenty, but it is survival, and survival was the highest gift the North ever gave. For the raiders and voyagers, seaweed carried its worth across the whale road as well. Bundles dried and packed could be chewed when supplies thinned at sea, restoring salt and strength to weary men. It kept scurvy, the wasting sickness of sailors, at bay, though they did not know the name for what they prevented. What they did know was that when the lips of men cracked, their gums bled, and their strength faltered, the sea's greens revived them. In the hold of a longship, alongside barrels of herring and bundles of stockfish, there lay humble wrappings of dried kelp quiet lifelines for men who dared sail to the edge of the known world. The strength of seaweed and kelp was not sung, yet it was woven into the Viking story like the knots of their carvings, subtle but unbreakable. It was food, it was medicine, it was trade, it was fodder, it was fuel. The Norse did not revere it with glory, but they relied on it as they did on the strength of their ships and the steadiness of their axes. When the land failed, the sea provided, and when the sea withheld its fish, it still gave of its weeds. In this balance, the Vikings found resilience, making do with what others might scorn, drawing endurance from what seemed least valuable. So it was that seaweed and kelp, overlooked by the proud and dismissed by the poets, played their part in shaping endurance. In their leathery fronds was the trace of survival, in their briny flesh the minerals of life itself. Without them, more winters would have swallowed more lives, more voyages would have ended in weakness before land was sighted. They were the overlooked bounty of the cold seas, quiet saviours of the north, as essential as barley, fish, or honey. And though their role was humble, their gift was mighty, for they gave the Vikings strength to endure in a world that demanded nothing less. In the telling of Viking glory, the poets chose to carve their words in steel and blood. They sang of raids, of kings who raised their banners, of warriors who met death with a song on their lips. Yet none of those sagas, not one verse, would have lived if the belly had been empty. The true foundation of power was not forged only in iron, or carried only on the whale road. It was built in the hearth fire's glow, in the quiet labour of women stirring porridge, in the gathering of berries, in the drying of fish, in the patient ferment of milk into skyer. It was in the hidden stores, the forgotten superfoods that gave the Norse endurance when all else seemed to wither. Together, they were not luxuries but weapons, as sharp and necessary as the axe or shield, without which the Viking age would have been no more than a whisper lost in the frost. The North was a land that offered little freely. Its winters were merciless, its fields thin, its storms cruel. To endure it, the Norse had to learn a truth harsher than battle. No man fights, no woman weaves, no child grows without strength in the body. That strength came not from feasts alone, but from the quiet staples that could last when the days grew long with darkness, barley bread that filled the belly when the soil froze, oats and rye that gave endurance for voyages, fish salted and dried carrying the sea's life into every season, skyer thick with strength, healing herbs and berries red and blue, honey that sweetened and preserved, nuts and seeds that kept hunger at bay, and even seaweed, humble yet mighty, drawn from the waves when the land gave nothing. These were not the foods of kings alone, but of every hearth that dared to resist the cold. Each was a weapon of endurance, sharpened not in the forge but in the patient craft of survival. With them, the Norse conquered hunger, which was the cruelest enemy of all. Hunger broke armies before swords did. Hunger weakened oarsmen before storms struck. Hunger emptied halls before rivals could. But with these stores, the Norse stood unbroken, their bodies steady, their spirits fierce. These foods were as much a part of conquest as the longship itself. Without them, no raider would have had the strength to row across a foreign sea, no settler the endurance to carve a farm from icy ground, no skald the breath to sing the stories that echo even now. Think of the longship setting out from a fjord at dawn. The men grip their oars, the sea foams under the prow, and their faces are set like stone. Yet behind that iron resolve lies the food they carried. Stockfish bundled in sacks, oatcakes tucked away, honey sealed in horn, nuts for the lean moments, skyer packed in vessels. These were their silent allies, keeping hunger from gnawing at their bones, keeping weakness from dragging their arms. The ship's keel may have split the waters, but it was food that carried it forward across endless waves. Think too of the longhouse in the dead of winter, when snow pressed against the roof, and the nights seemed endless. The hearth fire burned low, but the family endured. They opened their stores, berries sealed in honey, bread of rye still sharp with sourness, broth thickened with seaweed, flax seeds stirred into porridge, hazelnuts cracked by the children's hands. These were not feasts of abundance, but feasts of survival, each mouthful of victory against frost and famine. And from such quiet victories, great things were born. Children who lived to grow, warriors who lived to fight, women and men who carried their bloodlines forward through centuries of hardship. In this, the feast was more than food, it was power. It was the unspoken strength that allowed the Norse to raise their ships and strike across the world, to claim lands in Ireland, in England, in Greenland, even to reach Vinland beyond the western seas. No kingdom is carved without the nourishment that feeds the hand that swings the axe. No saga is told without the breath sustained by humble porridge and fish broth. The power of the Viking age did not rest solely in courage or cunning. It rested too in the food that kept them alive long enough to turn courage and cunning into history. The poets may not have sung of barley or seaweed, of flax seeds or lingonberries, yet in every verse they composed, those foods are hidden between the lines. They are the unseen chorus beneath the clash of steel, the quiet rhythm beneath the beating of oars. To forget them is to forget the truth of the Viking age, that glory rests not only in the spear but also in the hand that stirs the cauldron. That power is not only in the Feast of Kings but in the steady meals that endured in the silence of winter. Together, these forgotten superfoods were the shield wall against hunger. They were the foundation upon which the sagas were built. Without them, the North would have swallowed its people long before their names crossed seas. Without them, no kingdoms would have been raided, no lands settled, no legacies carved into stone. With them, the Vikings endured, thrived, and carried their strength farther than any before them. So when we speak of the age of longships and warbands, let us remember also the bowls of porridge, the bundles of dried fish, the jars of berries, the vessels of skyer, the honey sealed in horn, the nuts and seeds cracked by firelight. These were the true feast, the feast of survival, and from survival was born power. Power enough to carve kingdoms, cross oceans, and leave behind stories still alive 1,000 years later. In their food, as in their steel, the Vikings found their immortality.